So if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to do so. I'm really pleased to be able to present our two speakers this evening. They're both individuals whose work I admire greatly and whose work has been a rich resource for me in researching Art in the Asylum exhibition. So it's wonderful to have them here. So just to give you an idea of the plan of this evening, firstly, Dr. Nick Tromans is going to speak. Nick is curator of the Watts Gallery in Surrey and is an expert on Richard Dad, the life and work of Richard Dad, and he's going to be talking around that subject for about half an hour. And then we're going to take a 10-minute break around 7 p.m. And then we're going to reconvene for a talk by Professor Roger Cardinal. And Roger, I'm sure his name will be familiar to lots of you. Roger is the author of the seminal text Outsider Art and coined that term. And that book was published in 1972. And he is an absolute expert on this genre and all subjects around it. So it's a pleasure to have him here. And after both the formal talks, then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So I hope you'll join us for that so that you can share your comments and input and perhaps ask the speakers any questions that you'd like to. So I'd like to invite our first speaker to join me at the front. There's a lectern microphone, yes.
Fantastic.
I'll just open your presentation for you. Is that okay? So, very warm welcome to Dr. Nick Sherman.
Thank you, Victoria. That's very kind of you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along to this really fantastic venue, which I haven't been to before. It's a great privilege to be here at Nottingham Contemporary, and I'm especially excited to be here, as I was just explaining to my colleagues, because the director here tells me that he's planning an exhibition of all things, George Frederick Watts, the man whose art collection I look after in Compton, near Guildford. And I hope that as a result of that exhibition, which I think is coming up next year, I think that's right, not too long in the future anyway, that as a result of that, there'll be a better relationship ongoing between the constituency, the audience, the friends of Nottingham Contemporary, that means you, and the Watts Gallery down in Surrey. And I hope that many of you will, having had a chance to see the art of Watts here on your home turf, will come and visit us. So there's a plug for the Watts Gallery to begin with. Second, a plug for the exhibition. I believe it continues at the Djanogly Gallery until the 3rd of November. And I really urge you very, very strongly to go and see it if you haven't already. It is absolutely fantastic. It's fantastic visually, it's fantastic intellectually, it's fantastic as a piece of logistics, because if you look at where all those loans have come from, I think over 100 loans to that wonderful exhibition, then they come from a range of the key collections, private and public, of whatever you want to call it, psychiatric art, outsider art, art from asylums. And I don't think we're likely to see such a conjunction of collections put together again for many years. So it really is a rare opportunity, thanks to Victoria and her team, to go and see that collection. Now, those are the plugs over. So I'm starting off by talking about the 19th century and the relationship of 19th century art and 19th century aesthetic themes in the context of art and the asylum, or the history of psychiatric art. I think it's fair to say, and this is a deliberately vague generalization that I entirely expect Roger to knock down very quickly, that when most people think of outsider art, they think of psychiatric art, art in the asylum, they think pretty much of images that are expressionistic in the general sense. They think of somebody trying to express themselves in a very urgent, immediate fashion. They think perhaps of fauvism, they think of cubism, they think of surrealism, they think of those big, bold, dramatic, I am here art movements of the early 20th century. And it's an interesting question historically whether that is because the kind of art that we're interested in tonight really does look like that, or because those were the art movements which were current and dominant around the time of the great discoveries and the first major publications by people such as Hans Prinzhorn on our subject. So there's a kind of historical conjunction in the early 20th century when the rediscovery of the art of the insane, to use that title, was contemporary to specific art forms which it has ever since become related to and is seen perhaps through the lens of, or perhaps each is seen indeed through the lens of the other. There's a symbiotic relationship there. Now, for those of us like myself who are 19th century specialists, it's great to see at the exhibition at the Djanogly a successful attempt in the beginning of the exhibition to say, well, let's go back to the middle of the 19th century. Let's actually ask what were the relationships between psychiatry, which of course was a German word not yet used in English until around 1900. What were the relationships between psychiatry and art in the period before anyone had coined these new terms to describe the modern art movements of the 20th century? What were, to put it at its simplest, the relationships between medicine, psychiatry, and, let's say, the picturesque, the idea of searching out specific real corners of the world and copying them accurately as possibly as you could, with the great 18th and 19th century aesthetic principle. What were the relationships between psychiatry, medicine, and realism? What were the relationships between medicine and then the use of history painting, the use of myth, the use of all those inherited bodies of legend from the Bible, from the Middle East, from Christianity, from all over the world that were of such importance to 19th century academic artists? Now, that's really what I want to start to talk about. Now, the exhibition does this very well. Now, the picturesque as an aesthetic theory says that there are little bits of nature that really exist. You can point to them, you can touch them, you can isolate them, that are individually worthy of being represented. And I would suggest that asylum art, insofar as we can generalize about it, all sorts of caveats seem to attach to every sentence one wants to make about this subject, and properly so perhaps. In the 18th and 19th century, asylum art, I feel, was very much fixed from the point of view of the doctors on the picturesque. The picturesque was a way of saying to patients, look, whatever your delusions, whatever your imaginings, whatever your confusions, let us agree something simple. Let us agree that that flower in that pot really exists. Let's say no more than that. Let's agree that very simple baseline. Why don't you paint it? Why don't you draw with watercolor that flower? Why don't you draw that wall, that building? So the picturesque can be a way, I think, in the 18th and 19th centuries, in a medical context, of beginning a process of using imagery therapeutically in order to establish a very minimal agreement about the basis of reality between the doctor and the patient. Now, for instance, and here I'm borrowing from the research of Sarah Cheney, a young researcher in this field, she points out that in the 1880s at Bethlehem Hospital, by far the most famous British hospital, catering to the mentally ill in the UK, where Richard Dadd himself, who I'm going to talk about in a bit, was a patient for 20 years. At Bethlehem, watercolour painting, especially for the ladies, and watercolour painting was perhaps particularly a ladylike pursuit for non-professionals, watercolour painting was specifically part of the larger therapeutic regime. You didn't need to be a talented artist, you didn't need to have a particular condition. It was considered to be a useful thing for all lady patients to do, and they were set to work, for instance, to decorate the wards with lovely watercolours of flowers, such as the ones I just imagined being set for patients. And there is a dormitory ward at Bethlehem, a photograph taken probably at the beginning of the 20th century, but reflecting, I think, some of the practices I've discussed around the picturesque. Now, in September, I think many of you here were present at the lecture that was given by Dr. Maureen Park, who is the great expert on the wonderful collection put together by Dr. Brown up at his asylum, the Crichton Royal Asylum up in Dumfries in Scotland. And that collection, again, is not necessarily dominated by, but certainly contains a wealth of picturesque imagery. And on the cover of Maureen's book, in fact, was this wonderful image of a famous Scottish castle landmark in Edinburgh. And this is by an artist called Blacklock, who was actually a quite distinguished kind of pre-Raphaelite style landscape painter before his illness took him to Crichton in the 1850s, where he was encouraged to continue to make these picturesque sketches of real things. So I'm setting out to start with, just by suggesting that this was a point through image making, through art, if we want to call it that, that existed quite early on between doctors and their patients. Now, I was enormously excited to see at the very beginning of the exhibition images which I've been using in lectures for several years, but never actually seen in the flesh, borrowed from Edinburgh University Library. These are two of a series, and you can see the whole series pretty much, of large diagrams illustrating the different possible conditions of mental damage or mental illness that were made apparently for Dr. Brown, the superintendent of the Crichton Asylum, by one of his patients, William Bartholomew, who was a member of the still flourishing map-making company. And you can see, I think, some of the kind of precision of map-making there in these images, which were used by Dr. Brown for lectures on mental illness, on the taxonomy of mental illness, that Brown delivered to his staff. So what you've got here is a very interesting example of a patient labouring himself under some form of mental illness, but with a talent for art, being used to supply medical illustrations which were then used to educate the staff, who in turn, in a cycle of relationships, were presumably treating the artist. And I think this is very interesting because, again, the picturesque, and this is what these images ultimately are, they're picturesque images of unique human beings. They are picturesque in that fundamental sense of a little corner of concrete nature which is in and of itself worthy of depiction for some reason or other. The picturesque turned into, by Brown, a really meaningful, in his own terms at least, process whereby art, image making, and based around the representation of little pockets of reality can be used in this case, an educational, professional educational context. Now, I'd like to talk about Richard Dadd. Now, Richard Dadd is a pretty famous Victorian painter. You can Google him, you can look up his biography pretty quickly, you can read about him anywhere. I do not intend to give you a potted biography. I understand that many of you have been attending, not all of you I'm sure, but many of you have been attending throughout this lecture series, so I shan't just give you, and then he did this, and then he did that. I'll try to go a couple of steps beyond that. What I want to do is talk about Richard Dadd, born in Kent, 1817, to pick out a little bit more some of these ideas around 19th century aesthetic principles and how they encountered and were encountered by medicine. Here's Richard Dadd as a young man, a self-portrait etching made around 1840. Richard Dadd was, by all accounts, almost too good to be true as a young man, brilliantly talented, very handsome, very elegant, very charming, could get on with everybody, everybody loved him, and he was absolutely destined for great things, and everybody really just sat back and watched him rise, which he did very quickly by painting initially fantastic images from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. This is Puck sitting on his toadstool while all kinds of naked boys and girls dance around in the foreground. It's conceived as a kind of Renaissance tondo with indeed allegorical Renaissance or Baroque figures such as river gods, the kind of imagery you might see around a map perhaps of the Renaissance period in the corners, or if you are feeling fancy, the spandrels of the image. Now, I'd just like to start by pointing out that because Richard Dadd went mad, to use the crudest possible description of his career, it's all too easy, and people have fallen into this trap, possibly I have, of saying, gosh, isn't he imaginative? Isn't he out there? Isn't it extraordinary that he is so imaginative all the time, and gosh, imagination must be linked to madness, and I'm sure there's some academic paper that proves that somewhere. It's all too easy to say that, whereas in fact, if you are kind of very cool and collected and coldly art historical about it, it's not difficult to point out that what a surprise, as a very young man, Richard Dadd pinched ideas from other artists. And of course he did, because what artist ever didn't do that when you were aged 18, 19, 20? That's what you're supposed to do by any principle of art. You're supposed to start by learning by the people you admire. He admired the great Irish romantic painter Daniel Mcleese. This is Mcleese's painting of the 1830s of Bottom having a bad time as a result of the involvement that he gets into with Oberon and Titania. And in that picture, in the bottom left, you can see Puck on his toadstool, surrounded by little nymphs and nymphets dancing around with no clothes on. And actually, in the rest of that picture, too, I shan't bother to illustrate it just now, but in that image, you can actually see a kind of condensed archive of Shakespearean fairy imagery from which Dadd borrowed throughout the early 1840s. So Dadd, from the beginning of his career, was someone who was not so very strange in his fundamental approach to art by the standards of the day. He went to the Royal Academy, very standard. He fell in love with the Elgin marbles and spent a long time copying them, very standard. He exhibited in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester in order to get his client base established. Again, very, very normal. And indeed, he did something that was almost so normal, it was very old-fashioned. He went on a grand tour as a companion artist to a gentleman traveller, Sir Thomas Phillips. And there is Sir Thomas Phillips doing, again, very conventionally, dressing up as an Ottoman gentleman, complete with his hubbly-bubbly pipe and his turban and his divan and his gown. And this is a watercolour by Richard Dadd, who accompanies Thomas Phillips on this extraordinary tour all around the Mediterranean throughout the Ottoman Empire. Now, again, I'm emphasising at the moment how conventional, essentially, I mean, better than average, Dadd's a wonderful artist, I feel, but essentially in his aesthetic principles, he's not so very strange. He is, for instance, very attracted, and you can't see these drawings, I'm afraid, unless you really squint, which is a shame because they're absolutely beautiful. Dadd filled sketchbooks with tiny, tiny drawings made with extremely sharp pencils of all the wonderful landscapes that he saw in Italy, in Greece, in Turkey, in what was then called Syria, that is modern-day Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, etc. In Egypt, up and down the Nile, the pyramids. Incredible kind of visual archive of that tour. Very, very precise, very, very picturesque. So Dadd's principles then, from the beginning of his career, are to borrow from other artists, to borrow from the iconographic repertoire available to him, established from the past, and to focus upon the picturesque. And during his long 40-plus year career in asylums, Richard Dadd was a patient at Bethlehem Hospital in South London between 1844 and 1864, and then for even longer, in fact, from 1864 up until his death in the 1880s, he was a patient at Broadmoor, the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum, to give it its full title. Dadd showed signs of mental distress towards the end of his European and Middle Eastern tour. In 1843, he returned home, and tragically, as perhaps is too often tragically the case, a person suffering from a delusional paranoiac illness, such as he seems to have, turned on the person who was closest to them, turned on the person who was the only person who stuck by them through their difficult behaviour, and that was his father. And Richard Dadd killed his father and was then apprehended in France, where he had gone to try to escape. He was apprehended in France, taken initially to the Clermont asylum. So actually Dadd was a patient at 3 asylums. First of all at Clermont for a year, north of Paris, then at Bethlehem, then at Broadmoor. But it's at Bethlehem that he is really best remembered as an artist engaged in this hospital. This is the hospital about which we know most of any, perhaps, in the 19th century. It is, of course, today, what remains of it, the Imperial War Museum. You'll recognise that facade there. That's Bethlehem at the beginning of the 20th century. Richard Dadd became a patient in the criminal wing of this bleak hospital, that is to say, the bleakest part of it, in 1844. At that time, the hospital had no residing physician. The only doctors came in once or twice a week to do the rounds. One of them was a man called Alexander Morrison. More about him in a second. But actually the doctor who was given Dadd as a patient was the man on the left of this group portrait of psychologists, because of course there were no psychiatrists yet in the UK. On the left, E.T. Munro, Edward Munro, whose father and grandfather had both been physicians to Bethlehem Hospital, which is a polite way of saying, of course, that he had inherited the job of psychiatrist to Richard Dadd and didn't really take very much interest in him. Interestingly, on the right of this image is Alexander Sutherland, who happens to have been the first doctor to examine Richard Dadd before the murder. In fact, Richard Dadd's father, the victim of the murder, asked Alexander Sutherland, the chap on the right, to come and have a look at Richard, or at least to have described to him, to Sutherland, the symptoms. And Sutherland recommended that Dadd be put into a hospital, and that was not done. And possibly it was the advice and the initiative to have him, as it were, put away, that led to Dadd turning on his father. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that Richard Dadd's doctor really wasn't very interested in him, but thankfully, the other doctor who was doing the rounds, did take an interest. This is the wonderful portrait by Richard Dadd in now the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh of Alexander Morrison, a long-standing asylum doctor, often catering to the upper classes, who became to Dadd a patron, a benefactor, and I think it's fair to say Morrison tried to be to Richard Dadd a friend. Dadd didn't really believe in friendship, I don't think, at this point in his life, so that wasn't possible. But certainly this was the nearest thing, I think, that we can point to in terms of a professional friendship between the patient and the doctor. By the time the picture was painted, Morrison had lost his job in one of the periodic great kind of reshuffles, let's call it that Bethlehem underwent during the course of the 19th century. And what happened was that Alexander Morrison got his daughter to send down from Edinburgh to London a drawing of their home near Newhaven, outside Edinburgh, and Dadd painted this portrait on the basis of that sketch and incorporated into it not only the portrait of Alexander Morrison himself, but for good measure 2 Newhaven fishwives, just to set the scene in a kind of deliberately almost ironic, even sarcastic perhaps, reference to the picturesque. Because if you wanted, before people started falling in love with kilts and sporrans and the Highland stuff, if you wanted to indicate that the picture was set in Scotland, you might often have included a Newhaven fishwife. Now we know that Alexander Morrison became the owner of very many works by Dadd. He, to be fair to him, often tried to pay Dadd for these works, but he wasn't allowed to because that contravened Bethlehem's regulations about patients receiving money. It's very difficult, sadly, to identify exactly which of the surviving works by Dadd were owned by Morrison, but I have succeeded in connecting up a few of them, and one of them is this. It survives today in the Wellcome collection in London, a wonderful drawing, rather hard to read initially, but it is called Aesculapius Discovered by the Shepherds, and it is signed Richard Dadd, Bethlehem, Christmas 1851. It is in effect Richard Dadd's Christmas gift or Christmas card for 1851. Now, according to Greek legend, Aesculapius, the godfather, or by some accounts literally the god of medicine, the inventor of medicine, the founder of medicine, is imagined, as he was described in Greek myth, abandoned on a hillside, raised by bears and other wild animals, and then discovered by shepherds who kneel down to adore him. Now, it didn't take long for Richard Dadd to work out this sounded suspiciously like another story that one often hears at Christmas, and you'll see that the baby Aesculapius has a halo, and looks for all the world like the baby Jesus being adored by the shepherds. Now, I want to make rather a fuss of this drawing, or at least I want to make a big claim using it as an illustration, which is that it sums up an awful lot of Dadd's approach to art during this period of his career, which is to say that he was a kind of comparative anthropologist or comparative mythologist before such grandiose terms had been invented as they eventually were at the end of the 19th century to describe people like Fraser, the author of The Golden Bough, and later Claude Lévi-Strauss, the inventor of structural anthropology, which argues that every culture is pretty much the same if you can just translate the exact concrete manifestations of the culture back into certain fundamental principles of human interaction. And Dadd loved this idea. He loved the idea that nothing had ever changed, that the early Greeks, the primitive Arcadian Greeks, the first Greek poets, Homer, Theocritus, had established Western culture, and that all that had happened ever since was that people had either copied them or forgotten about them and then rediscovered them. He loved this idea that even Islam, even Christianity, even Judaism, were all of them really just the Greek myths retold. Even the Egyptian myths he saw as fundamentally analogous to, translatable into the Greek legends. And indeed it was under the delusion that he was being instructed by the Greek god of the dead, Osiris, that he committed the murder of his father. So Dadd is deliberately mixing legends, mixing myths, and I think what is particularly exciting intellectually here is that one of those legends is the medical legend, the myth of the founding of medicine, which goes back to Hippocrates, which goes back to Aesculapius, which goes back to these founding Greek myths. So Dadd seems to be, and I hate to say when one's talking about an image, he seems to be saying, because he's not saying, I don't think he's drawing, he seems to be drawing the idea that medicine has its legends, medicine has its rhetoric, medicine has its myth, but those myths are ultimately translatable back into the kind of myths, the foundation myths of ancient Greece, and why, and therefore he is a patient of these rather grand doctors, who he seems to have considered to be perfectly nice gentlemen. Those gentlemen, in their frock coats and with their little medicine bags and their complicated job titles, may have their myths of what they were doing, and there's nothing wrong with those myths, but ultimately they were just another layer of myth. Now, the doctor who is most associated with Dad is the Dr. W. Charles Hood, H-O-O-D, Charles Hood, who was resident physician superintendent of Bethlehem from the early 1850s onwards. It was his job, as it was the job of every new superintendent, to clear out the old abuses and bring in a nice new enlightenment regime. It's one of those things that needs to be done every few years. And it was Hood's job to do this. He was not, as he appears here, with his wonderful sort of Crimean, Ruskinian beard. In a later photographic portrait, he was actually still in his 20s, believe it or not, when he was appointed resident superintendent physician of Bethlehem, the most famous psychiatric hospital, as we would now call it, in the world, really. And his youth was symbolic of what his trustees, or those governors strictly, wanted from him, which was energy. They didn't want highfalutin, clever ideas. They wanted him to get on his hands and knees, so to speak, as modern management consultancy puts it, and get in there and learn the names of the patients, write case notes for the patients, make sure the patients are okay, really get to know them, really look after them. That was the rhetoric, that was the idea. And I think, just about managed to convince myself that if you remove the beard, look at the hair, look at that strong nose, that this is Hood as a young man. People always say it is, it's just there's no proof, but I think it probably is. This is a portrait, certainly, by Richard Dad in the Tate Gallery, certainly, of a young man wearing a professional's outfit and sitting on a garden bench with a fez and a huge sunflower and a lawnmower in the back, not lawnmower, lawn roller in the background on the right. I think it probably is the young Hood. Now, Hood's relationship with Dad is complex and fascinating, but we can certainly say that as a result of Hood's appointment, Richard Dad's production rate, if nothing else, goes up several steps. Immediately after Hood appears in the early 50s, suddenly Dad starts doing these things he hadn't done before, much more ambitious paintings and much more ambitious sequences of watercolours, not just one-offs now, but great big sequences. And the most famous sequence is that known as Sketches to Illustrate the Passions, which is rather comparable to what Bartholomew was doing in those black and white images I began with for Brown at Crichton. That is, Dad is saying, well, let's ask what could cause madness. And Dad comes up with no fewer than 32 possible reasons. Some of them are things like miserliness, or loneliness, or love, or a tendency to gambling, or a tendency to drink. So Dad has, I think, appointed himself as a kind of amateur taxonomist of mental illness. And often the most reproduced image from that sequence of the Passions is this one, which represents agony, raving madness. And this is often shown because people say, well, isn't it interesting that someone who is supposed to be themselves mad should try to represent madness so negatively? But actually, what we can do with this image, and I think we can do this with many other of the images in the Passion series, is show how visual they are rather than medical. Now, by that I mean that Dad has deliberately, in many cases, in the Passion series of watercolours, referred back to earlier iconography, and by iconography I mean a habit of representing a particular subject that artists have acquired over the years and maintain. He refers back to iconography of the past. For instance, I believe, but few people seem to believe me, but let's see if you can buy this. I think that this image of raving madness, Dad has been borrowing from the bottom right-hand corner image of the famous illustrated frontispiece to Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, the single most famous book on madness in English before the 19th century. If I blow that up, there is the figure of the maniacus, of the maniac. I think that the image that Dad provides of raving madness, the maniac, oops, spoiled my surprise. I think that Dad has been borrowing from that. So what I take from that is, again, that Dad is saying, well, yes, madness comes in all shapes and sizes. Madness can be caused by just about any traumatic experience, and madness, when it manifests itself, in turn can be described or summarized under a myriad of different headings, but then he seems to suggest actually all of them are already with us. They are already with us in the iconography of art, in that archive of imagery which can come from medical history, from Greek history, Roman, biblical history. It's all there already, he says, and your new highfalutin medical jargon can add new taxonomic lists and can tweak and rearrange and, as it were, reshuffle the cards of myth, but the myth as a body of legend and imagery will remain in place. And generally speaking, more broadly across Dad's work, I think we can, gosh, it's 7:05. I will be winding up already. Then I think even more broadly across Dad's work, we can see this kind of almost like crab-like, as I like to put it, movement of thinking. So instead of arguing through to say, you know, for instance, as academic art historians all too often do, say, I don't know, here's an image of X, that symbolizes Y, and therefore we can point to the fact that the artist takes up position Z on these issues. You know, you kind of deconstruct the image back to a political position almost. I think Dad very deliberately moves sideways without going anywhere because, to repeat, there was nowhere for him to go. He didn't believe that humanity could go anywhere, because it was trapped in this recycling historical situation whereby all you could ever do was repeat in different terms and different structures the myths of the past. And one of the most striking, sadly, this is one of his watercolours that has faded rather drastically over the years, but it's worth looking it up online afterwards, having a better look. I've never seen it look quite so ginormous, I have to say. The real thing's smaller than a piece of paper. And this is called The Child's Problem. And in it, he kind of riffs iconographically on the idea of black and white, starting with the chessboard. The problem referred to in the title is a chess problem, a very simple one, so people who are good at chess assure me. I don't think I could solve it. A black and white on the chessboard, and then in the background, in the middle, at the top, you can see a white sculpture, a perfect white marble Greek sculpture of a crouching nymph. And as many people say, you know, that Greek sculpture was championed in the 19th century as being a kind of beautiful, pure whiteness. But on the left of that, a figure of a black person, specifically a slave in America, who is represented in Dad's imagery as the icon of the anti-slavery campaign. Am I not a man and a brother? So again, he's moving sideways between reality, legends, and myths, not, as it were, trying to work through them. Here's a photograph of Dad in the later 1850s, painting a picture, a wonderful painting called Contradiction, which is now in the collection of Andrew Lloyd Webber. I don't know why, that always gives me pleasure to tell people that. Just seems so unlikely. And finally, because I'm going to wrap up now, to make sure I'm not misreading my watch, no, I am going to wrap up now, the last major picture that Dad painted in Broadmoor in the 1870s is called Wandering Musicians, and I'm very fond of this picture. It's not technically his greatest thing, it's not compositionally his most interesting thing, but I love it because it really does show him coming back at the end of his life, because he did die not long after this, coming back to really where he felt everything did go back to, this kind of Greek bucolic idea, this Greek pastoral Arcadian idea. He represents pretty much himself in the guise of the shepherd in the middle. He seems to have invented for himself a wife and child, which he didn't have in reality, of course. And in the foreground, you can just about make out the ruins of parts of that temple, and inscribed in those blocks which have tumbled down from that temple are inscribed the names of various very early Greek poets, amongst them Theocritus. And really what I take away from this image is the way that at the end of his life, Dad has returned to the picturesque. He's returned to this very close identification of specific landscapes that he's seen throughout his career. He continues to go back and back and back to the little drawings he made, and I think the background landscape on the right of this painting is definitely one of those landscapes he really saw somewhere in the Middle East, and it encapsulates his philosophy, which is at once both pessimistic in terms of the notion of human progress, but also to him in his condition very reassuring that whatever he's told, whatever he goes through, that ultimately nothing ever really changes. And I think I'm going to have to rattle to an end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, very much for those absolutely fascinating insights into Dad's work, and also for exploring some of those relationships between patient art and the relationship with their psychiatrists and those who cared for them. So as I said, we're going to just take a short 10-minute break now, and then we'll reconvene with Professor Cardinal's talk. So if I can ask you to, if you are going to leave the space, to reconvene at 7:20. Thank you. And we're going to save questions and discussion till the end and have it all together. I think we'll do it as a group. Thank you. Did you want some water over here while you're speaking?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Some more.
Did you want a glass of water?
No, I've already got one. I've got one here.
I didn't. Oh,
Hidden away.
of course, yeah.
Yeah. All the theatrical tricks.
That's how I get my students to be quiet. Okay, thank you everybody. Welcome back. And now I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Roger Cardinal.
Mustn't it have been fun to go to Bedlam in the 18th century in your finery and to go and see people, there's the finery, who are melancholic, idiotic, depressed, raving, hard of hearing. What they didn't realise was that some people are actually being creative. And this is well known to be perhaps the first picture, or evidence indeed, of psychotic art from the asylum. Goethe, the great classicist of German culture, went on a journey to the south, to Italy, and wound up in Sicily, where he was taken to a very curious mansion called the Villa Palagonia, which I gather one can still visit. It's within the corpus of the town of Palermo. And it looks like a wonderful place to visit. Goethe was led round the different halls and rooms of this place and saw the structuring, the decorative structuring through the carvings that he'd ordered and had put in. Goethe came out of the house in a hurry and recorded in his famous journal of his Italian journey, what a madhouse. Now that's the extreme classicist speaking, as it were. There is such a thing as in his vision as a form of activity which cannot be tolerated, which should in effect be kept under wraps, if not actually extinguished, depending how hard you had to work to get somebody to keep quiet. But the shrieks of bedlam, the attitudes, the strangeness of madness, was for him anathema. He was definitely an anti-romantic, and the more he heard about the growing romantic movement in his late classical period, as he's writing wonderfully tuned hexameters in German, as it were, reproducing what he saw to be the classical style, and maintaining a sense of dignity, purposefulness, calm, and above all, precision and control. Fortunately, the Romantic movement stumble and moved on. And here's a little-known man who emerged within that period in the Black Forest, a man called Justinus Kerner, who was a physician who ran a kind of boarding house, an impromptu boarding house for people who had difficulties of a mental nature. And he was one of the first major therapists, although perhaps overshadowed by other therapists of the period, other doctors, because he didn't actually write a famous book, unfortunately. But he did look after people, and he did understand that what was being called madness or mental illness or divagations from the straight and narrow of the classical ideal were in fact part of the human condition, and that to know about madness and to understand the reasons behind madness, it was necessary to apply forms of docile treatment, therapies as it were. He actually massaged people as well as speaking to them and reading to them and sometimes playing music to them. And he had indeed a kind of permanent woman in his entourage who was a somnambulist and a clairvoyant. That will a little theme I'll bring up later, the theme of connection with psychic forces beyond rational ken. He himself, towards the end of his life, produced a kind of early version of surrealism in his ink blot fantasias. Take a piece of paper, splash a bit of ink on it, fold it down the middle and press, and you get creatures emerging, which you can then talk about, which are in effect messages from your unconscious, as the surrealists would put it, and which may or may not be helpful to your further existence. Insight into one's own difficulties, one's own unconscious strivings may well be the outcome of good therapy, but we'll pass on from the moment from heavy psychology of that sort. This is Walter Morgenthaler, whose book on the artist Adolf Wöfli, whom you glimpsed at the very beginning of my talk, was the first book on a psychotic artist who was actually named and celebrated. So Morgenthaler, I think, has the reputation of having, in the 20th century, 1922, he worked in the Waldau Asylum, which is where a big, still existing institution outside Bern in Switzerland. And this is the subject of his famous book, Adolf Wöfli, the farm lad who made good, as it were, by evil means, and who was incarcerated for dastardly deeds and a roving psychic illness, which necessitated confinement. And here's one of my major points, really. Confinement is really what an asylum is about. In all British Victorian cities, an asylum was a place of confinement outside the city walls where one can safely suppress the vision, the actuality of madness, and perhaps indeed to forget about it. So doctors were there as custodians of peace and quiet, in effect, through early times. And that model of what psychiatry is supposed to do and what asylums are supposed to achieve persists into the 20th century. And now we have a new kind of confinement principle, which is to keep people quiet via certain therapeutic drugs. We'll go into that a little later. This is a picture by Wöfli, one of these early black and white drawings. Later on we'll see some more colourful ones, which explore the dimensions of his own psychic realm, which he invented from day to day and from hour to hour to produce a whole cycle of adventures and activities in the form of an invented autobiography in which he figures the main character, Saint Adolf II. A year later, Hans Prinzhorn, the famous German specialist of psychotic art, wrote his famous book, Die Bildnerei der Geisteskranken, the artistry of the mentally ill, and started something which, although not very many people immediately cottoned on to what he was doing, nevertheless gradually percolates through European culture and becomes a very important milestone in the history of the understanding and appreciation of psychotic art. These were the patients that he celebrated in his book with through illustrations, and indeed through 10 long case studies within the book, in which he emphasizes not the madness, well, he uses some of the technical terms and he shows himself to be au fait with psychiatric understanding of mental illness, but what he's really interested in, and where the book really makes its mark in a historical sense, is in understanding the artistic aspect, pictorial techniques and the thematic constants that emerge through various processes of the mind. Things like making symbols work, things like the decorative impetus, were part of his central concern.
Yeah, go on. Boy, go. We have some water. Is that mine? Yeah.
That's yours.
I'm fine.
So who would like to kick off? Yes?
In the last few months, I've been to several exhibitions that seem to focus on art of this sort. Djanogly, Welcome Collection, the Hayward, even a large section of the Venice Biennale were filled with art of this sort. Is this a long overdue recognition of this sort of art, or is there a danger that perhaps too many people are trying to plough the same furrow and next week it'll all be forgotten?
Well, I sincerely hope so, because we have to have cycles, and you can't keep something going forever. Cubism didn't last that long. Each art movement, if this is a movement, which it probably isn't, it's a trend within the art world, but it's not the artists that are making things happen so much as the dealers and the critics and so on. I'm not sure if there's any way of describing what's happening. It has now become very popular. There's a big exhibition opened in Paris at the Saint-Pierre a few weeks ago. There's the Outsider Art Fair that's been running in New York for 12 years. It's now starting up in Paris, and it is about to begin. If you're going to Paris, look out for the Outsider Art Fair. It'll probably pass, because there aren't that many collectors that, having started a sort of bubble and the prices going up, they'll reach an inevitable point when people can't afford the work anymore. And only if you've got a pet psychotic hermit in your garden can you benefit from a direct gift from the artist. So none of these artists, on the whole, runs around saying, I've got an exhibition, I'm in the Hayward Gallery, and I'm going to be famous. It's not like that. And art in this creative world is much more a personal adventure, which doesn't necessarily have a public audience in mind.
In terms of the exhibitions all happening, it certainly, on my part, wasn't strategic to coincide with those. I think it's more of a happy confluence. And I think broader than that, I think the interest in mental health, the urge to create, people who are institutionalized, I think it speaks to universal themes and emotions, which will always be of interest. So I think I hope there will be interest alongside. And I mean, personally, the work of Wolfli, I can think of nothing more fascinating. The more you look, the more you see. As Roger referred to, he didn't just paint, he also wrote, he created musical scores. And he, combined with very interesting biographical information, I think there's lots to discover and lots to relate to what's happening, not just historically, but to contemporary practice as well, art practice and mental health practice, which I'm interested in.
Yes, we sometimes forget that the real collectors are often artists. I mean, they're probably in the majority, because artists are keen on things that haven't been seen. They like new things, and they like to have their own version of that new thing. Not necessarily to copy, as in the way that Dubuffet ripped off a few of his artists in I think, quite a tender spirit. But in the sense that when you've got something unique, curious, enigmatic, you can look at it again and again. It's the case, I think, that outsider art attracts the eye and then leaves you without an answer always, so you want to come back and have another look. You must go back to the gallery again tomorrow.
I think in terms of contemporary mental health care, there's lots of interest in this idea of using creativity therapeutically in terms of recovery from mental illness. And there's a real, I work as an academic full-time, there's a real big pressure to provide evidence. We can see anecdotally that being creative is therapeutic, but there's this constant drive now to provide evidence. How does it work? Why does it work? How well does it work? Does it keep people out of hospital? These kind of measurables that we're needing to provide, and we're having to devise very creative research questions and measures, and I don't even know if we can measure it, but we're being asked to provide evidence for how these things work in order to demonstrate their effectiveness. Because the sad truth is that creating art, you need resources to do it. You need someone to facilitate you doing it, and commissioners are not going to pay for something if they don't think it's effective. And as we could see historically, often artists work with very crude materials. They didn't have art materials, but now, yes, we have to provide evidence for something working in order to encourage more people to use it.
Ghostly silence on the tape.
Thank you very much for two very stimulating talks, and also for the exhibition itself, which was most illuminating. One thing I didn't get from the exhibition was any linkage between what we saw expressed through the art and the mental conditions of the people producing the art, as to whether there was any commonality between the whatever form of mental illness they had and this sort of art or the content of the art that they produced.
Well, that whole question of using images from which to make diagnoses is, I think it's fair to say, in academic circles now, considered somewhere people don't want to go. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And that insofar as people have done rigorous, super kind of thing Victoria's talking about, really clearly defined scientific studies. For instance, my man, Richard Dadd, a Canadian academic psychiatrist, went through and applied some really strict criteria to try and see, could you actually name, measure, quantify what is it that makes Richard Dadd's art mad? And they came to the very clear conclusion, forget it. There's no scientific, by which I mean measurable, qualities in Richard Dadd's art which tell you that he had any particular condition. That's generally of a part with a larger tendency within academic and professional circles these days of not to label anybody with anything, which I think is a massive reaction we're still going through against the period when people were perhaps too handy with labels. So I think what you've identified is Victoria can speak to this as she curated the exhibition, but I think ultimately a healthy attempt to steer away from any too easy connections, which were made back in the very early days, weren't they? I mean, if you go back to some of the very first exhibitions of the art of the insane, one of the very first was held at Bethlehem Hospital in 1913. Interestingly, that exhibition also included children's art. In that case, there was a debate over whether or not the diagnoses should be exhibited along with the artwork, and the psychiatrists couldn't agree whether or not to do so. So that your question was being asked, has been asked for 100 years, and goes all the way back. In the end, that first Bethlehem exhibition, often seen as the first exhibition in Britain at least, they did not include the diagnoses.
Yeah, I think I was deliberately inviting the viewer, I am inviting the viewer to make their own decisions. And I'm also aware that mental illness itself is often contested as our diagnoses. And often what we know about the way people were represented historically, I mean, they wouldn't have the same diagnosis now. So we're not really sure often too, even though people may have had a label, was that actually what was happening? And you'll notice there's a number of artists in the exhibition like Scotty Wilson, Monsiel that Roger referred to, who never had any diagnosis, who never entered the psychiatric system. Yet, why is that? And obviously there's similarities with their work and other artists in the exhibition, but why is it that one person ends up with a label and one person doesn't? Why does one person end up in an institution and another doesn't?
Well, I think that does open up, to go back to what I was saying, that opens up this bigger picture of the whole history of this subject, which has often been couched, hasn't it, in terms of allowing the patient to speak back. That's the kind of rhetoric that we've had now for decades, rightly, which is that the patient should be given a voice of his or her own through art, through imagery, through writing, through having their letters or messages read. Arguably, and I do say this, for the sake of argument, that has become such a standard way of approaching the kind of issues we're all interested in. Maybe sometimes I feel, for instance, you always want the hospital to have a chance to speak back, not in the sense that they would disagree with their patient, but yeah, perhaps it would be interesting to see what was it like to be the doctor of Wolfli. It's almost as if, and this is no criticism of anyone, it's just an inevitable, ongoing, big question, that is it possible to represent in an exhibition, in a book, in a lecture, both sides of that often very complex and subtle and shifting a relationship? Maybe the pendulum does have to go backwards and forwards. I did include a chapter in my book, I think, on Richard Dadd called The Asylum Speaks Back, which is all about how asylums today, or in recent decades, we don't call them that anymore, of course, psychiatric hospitals have used their art collections to improve to put it very crudely, their public relations.
I met a young Scottish artist last week who is proposing just that sort of collaborative work with his clinicians. He's an artist, but he's also someone who's a user of mental health services, and he's trying to engage his clinicians in collaborative artwork so that they're able to give their own perspective, and he would facilitate their creativity, which I thought was a really interesting model. And on that theme as well, I would recommend the book by Mary Barnes and Joe Burke. And Mary Barnes is one of the artists in the show who wrote a book collaboratively called Two Journeys Through Madness, which presents Joe's perspective and Mary's perspective alongside each other.
Mm-hmm. There have been attempts to draw up a sort of formula which could be applied then to a fake artist who could do pictures which were really psychotic, because all the motifs were set out. You need glaring colours, you need to tear it a bit round the edges to show that the picture's had a hard life in the asylum, and so on. And then you could put it on show somewhere, and say, anonymous, of course, anonymous patient for the 1920s, age the picture a little, and it would be a great blockbuster.
Which of course, just putting my awkward hat on, and trying to stir up debate, that has been one of the besetting problems of this whole field, hasn't it? Has the artist suffered enough? Has the picture suffered enough? And I mean, Roger, you know much more about this with your breadth of knowledge than anybody here. But that was an issue, wasn't it, in some of the art, and it was alleged that was a problem for some of the artists in the collection out in Manchester, the big private collection that's gone to Manchester, from which Victoria's borrowed, where there was a bit of an anxiety because the artists seemed to get better, or that they weren't ill enough, and did they have to, what happened then? Could you carry on being an outsider artist once you were realigned or got happier, recovered? And I think from my Anaraki, academic art historical approach, that is an interesting question of where you put those labels. I think probably a healthy thing is not to obsess about labels at all too much, but
it's the artwork that matters. It's the artwork that speaks to us, and all too often we end up talking about the artist. And is it true that he assaulted his mother? Is it true that he took drugs? Is it what's going on here? we constantly, it's Van Gogh's ear syndrome, isn't it? That's the reason why we're interested in Van Gogh, because he was that crazy to cut off his ear. What about looking at the pictures? I mean, we're interested in him really because these pictures are so eloquent.
I thought Nick did that brilliantly in his talk about Dad, because yes, he mentioned the fact that Dad murdered his father, but in passing, that isn't the main message. The artwork is complex, is beautiful.
But I wouldn't have been commissioned to write that book if Richard Dad had not killed his father. And putting my anorak art historian's hat back firmly in place, Giorgio Vasari invents art history in the middle of the 16th century in the Renaissance, and biography is the means through which he says to people, go back and look at those early Italian artists that you've all forgotten about and haven't looked at for 200 years. And by the way, weren't they a funny bunch?
Yeah, and there is quite a lot of biographical detail in my exhibition about the show, because some people would argue that the work isn't as interesting if you don't know the backstory. And the backstories are absolutely fascinating, like Wolfley's story, like Mary Barnes's story, like William Bartholomew's story. Do you need that detail to make sense and for it to be interesting?
It rather depends what you want of a work of art. Do you want it to speak to you straight away? Do you want it to be mysterious? Do you want it to be only accessible through study of a host of other things and so on? And do you really require certain pieces of knowledge about the artist before you can start to enjoy the picture?
I like to think that the current exhibition is experiential as well as intellectual, because what people have been telling me through feedback, and I'm really interested to hear people's feedback, be it negative or positive, is that you need to go back a number of times to be with the work, as well as to read the detail and just to look at it and take the details in. So I'd like to think it's both.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in the therapeutic elements of art for people with psychiatric problems. And there doesn't seem to be very much discussion about that, really. It's all about these fantastic works of art. And what about the poor, ordinary people who are still in hospital these days who are doing art therapy? Not fantastic paintings, but for them it's really important. And I think that it becomes too easy to concentrate on the art rather than the therapy and the benefit it gives to the patients. And I just kind of like to get some sort of response to that, really.
I absolutely agree with you, and clearly tonight's event is focusing on more of an art historical perspective because of the participants, but one of our other associated events has looked at art therapy, specifically the history of art therapy and the practice of art therapy. And as part of my wider remit within the Institute of Mental Health where I work, I facilitate exhibitions of artwork by a range of people who use mental health services. And we look not just at aesthetics, but also inclusivity to ensure that people have the opportunity to have their work framed and hung in a place that has status. And I know that is immensely powerful. And last night I was speaking at an event in London on behalf of the Koestler Trust, which facilitates artwork from prisons and secure mental hospitals. So we were talking about the therapeutic use of art in those environments, and every year they have an exhibition, not just in London, but in various cities outside London, which is curated by various individuals. Last year it was Sarah Lucas, this year it's Speech to Bell, the musician, which showcases work which is submitted from prisons and secure mental hospitals. So there's lots of really excellent work being done, and there's lots of venues who are interested in that work. And personally, I do as much as I can to facilitate that for people who perhaps wouldn't find a home within a conventional art space.
But looking at the bigger picture again, what you raised there is the thorny issue of privacy as well, which is that art therapy is, like all kinds of therapy, should be, if not private, then only public insofar as the patient is willing for it to become so. I don't want my GP giving a lecture and telling the world about the things I turned up complaining about, whatever those might be. That horrifies me, even if it was to happen in 50 years' time. I think after my death, I don't like the thought of that. So that is a problem, a challenge, and I think that does compel us again to ask what we're doing when we exhibit this work or publish it or lecture on it. How are we making that division? Art therapists, professional art therapists, are, I'm sure rightly again, quite protective of their label and I shouldn't say label, of their professional practice, and are quite rightly keen on that privacy. So a lot of what you're talking about, I think, has been kept private.
Yeah, and let's not forget that much art created in asylums was destroyed because it was deemed to be of no value whatsoever because of the people who created it. And I think it also raises interesting ethical issues about identifying people. All the artists in my exhibition are deceased, so we couldn't seek consent. Where there are estates of existing family members, we can go back. But the exhibitions that I facilitate, people have the choice to be anonymous or not. I work closely with Rampton, which is a maximum security hospital. We have very strict protocols about artwork that comes out, about patients not being able to be identified. So there's lots of ethical issues about showing this work for living artists, and issues about consent and choice as well. Yes.
These can be summarised as issues of control, really. And there's constraint that's good and constraint that's bad. So when you talk about Rampton, I sort of immediately get my fists up.
Moving away.
One shouldn't rely on art therapy as the only treatment, as it were, for certain types of prisoner. And one shouldn't romanticise it either, no, I would think. Also, I did want to say at one point, there's also art therapy work which you wouldn't want to spend too much time looking at. You can't look at everything with the same curiosity. And if you had the chance of looking, if you juxtaposed a Wölfli with work from a workshop, an art therapy workshop, you almost certainly would say that the Wölfli was more interesting, and you would like to spend more time with that, and you would like to know more about it and read a book and so on.
Yeah.
Unless you're one of those art therapists who was looking, as Victoria mentioned earlier, for hard statistical evidence that certain therapeutic initiatives work and others don't. And if you were looking at it with that eye, you would care perhaps very much whether drawing landscapes makes better progress than drawing cityscapes or something. I mean, that comes down to the close medical supervision of images created under those circumstances.
Well, we're talking really about different ways of reading the signs that you've got in front of you. And some of those ways are dictatorial, or potentially so, when you're saying, I can see this chap's never going to get out here, let's put him on a vegetable diet and let him do a bit of lawn mowing and just keep him quiet.
Do some watercolours.
Yeah, but if there's an artist that says, a lot of artists write letters to their doctors, as I mentioned, saying, could you let me out, please? Is it possible? You have that authority. If so, why don't you exercise it? Let me out. But from that you can romanticize the idea that every picture is really a cry for help. But that's not, I think, entirely true, or couldn't be totally true. And a lot of pictures done by deeply engrossed and, to all intents and purposes, crazy artists are actually terribly meaningful. So what is it we're judging? Why would we judge a picture as the basis from which to infer a legal analysis, really, a legally binding analysis of somebody? This chap must be locked up because he's a danger to himself and to society because I've read something in his picture. On the whole, I think these pictures go so far beyond the reality of ordinary life, albeit with a strong sense that they have a relevance to ordinary life. But like all imaginative literature and art, that relationship is an oblique, suggestive, implicit relationship. And you can't take a picture and just give it a grade or analyze it as a clear symptom. The picture is always, in its own right, dictating its own terms of reference. If you take the picture to have, as it were, a personality of its own, you have to get to know that person intimately. If you really want to judge a picture as to whether it's a document or a work of art, I submit that eventually these two are actually the same thing, and that when you get a really good drawing by somebody who is disturbed, you could arguably say, it moves me greatly. I can divine what's going on behind this person's torment, and I feel moved by this picture. I'm also admire it, paradoxically perhaps, for its brilliant treatment. The constraint of the picture is actually itself a kind of cry for help, or a statement of intent, or something other than over and above the theme of the picture. There's so many things going off in all directions, I think, from a work of art. And by the way, calling it a work of art is really not necessarily very helpful. Calling it a document may not be very helpful. It's a picture. If we went back to some really innocuous phrases here, not claiming things like, where does the work of art begin, and where does it become a document? Where does it become worthless, and why shouldn't we throw it away? There are divisions that we try to erect, but in effect, every picture is valuable to the person making it, and every picture is what we attempt to make of it for us, and that's, again, a private matter. So there's a lot of private issues going on, I think.
It's the lady who's got the microphone. Oh, yes,
Me.
please, yes.
I wanted to respond to you because I'm an art psychotherapist and I work in child and adolescent mental health. And when I went to see the exhibition today, one of the things that came up for me was the notion of confidentiality. And obviously at the time, there might not have been the same parameters and the same boundaries and containment around what that person was doing in those sessions or in those groups. And that brought up the question of, if you had really interesting art that was more current, you would be much more faced with this difficulty of putting it up on a wall. Because if I said to one of my clients retrospectively at the end of a year's therapy, who happens to have created the most amazing artwork, oh, by the way, can I change our agreement and can I go and put it up? That client might want to please me, agree to it, and you have betrayed the trust. So in some ways, a lot of stuff that's very interesting gets lost in that way. And I thought about that in the context of funding, and that artwork is very evocative. And when you have a success story, you want to be able to show the art so that whoever's the commissioner, whoever, with it being so qualitative rather than quantitative, you want them to see the process, and that becomes impossible. So there is that dilemma, and that's kind of what I wanted to echo. And if you then set up a group and say, we do this and we are going to exhibit these pieces of work, inevitably you're not going to get the same emotional content and the same quality in the artwork.
Thank you very much for your comment. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to draw things to a close because I've just looked at my watch and it's 8:30 and I don't want to detain people beyond the stated finishing time. Thank you very much for attending, for your contributions and the discussion. And if you'd just like to join me by thanking Nick and Roger very much for coming along and sharing their knowledge and expertise with us.